So we'll do part two. So this one will be mostly about butterflies, native butterfly species, and the different types of plants, host plants, and also the types of plants they need for nectar. So, butterfly garden etiquette. So, last time we talked a little bit about the different species of butterflies. We talked about host plants so that you kind of understood the ecology and why that's important to butterflies. Now, we're going to talk about the different species, a little bit more about how you can attract them to your gardens, what you want to do, and what you don't want to do. I know a lot of folks out there are really into saving butterflies, so they'll go through in their garden and they'll pick them off of the host plants. They might bring them in a terrarium or an aquarium and try to raise them inside and then release them later. And there are pros and cons to that. There's a lot of research out there. Some that says that's a good thing, some that says that's not a good thing. So we're not going to dive too deep into all of that. But let's start out with just the simple stuff. When we're kids, sometimes it's fun to go out and capture butterflies and other insects and have them in a collection. And that's not always a good thing. Sometimes, in a captive situation where maybe you have a butterfly garden or butterfly house, they'll do that. They'll collect them after they pass on their own, and then they will sell those as a fundraiser. So I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. So if you find a butterfly that's already passed, that's perfectly fine. But obviously, for the conservation of the species in general, you don't want to do that. So, uh, you know, I know we can't go back and do anything in time, but now moving forward, it's best to kind of live and let live in my way. Just kind of, have the habitat for them and observe them in nature, provide them their host plants, provide them a nectar source, provide them a water source. But if you've got kids that are around and there's a possibility that they may want to capture a butterfly, I would personally say just let it go. I know you can buy those little nets at Hobby Lobby and all of that, but to me, even though it says here you can observe them and capture them and let them go, I would just simply observe them on the flower and let them be. So again, if you want to capture the caterpillar or the larval stage for a little bit just to observe it, that again to me would be just fine. I've done that with sphinx moths, and we've had raised them and released them shortly after, but we haven't done that with multiples in one location. So I've got one in one container, one in another container, that kind of thing. So here they're talking about garden etiquette and using a plastic jar. This one's probably been used for Cheez-Its or Cheetos or something like that. Um, you know, you could, I would say, go for the caterpillars if you're going to do that because they are very fragile and those scales can come off very easily if they're flitting about in there. So this is more of a, I don't know if I would do that. It's good for kids. Kids really want to see them up close, and it's fun and it's interesting. But you can do that if you find one that's past, or one that's very nearly past. So if it's on its last legs and it's fluttering about and barely alive, that would be fine. But if it's a healthy one, just let it do its thing. So let's go into a little bit of difference between butterflies and moths. So most people are going to know, oh, it's a moth, or oh, it's a butterfly. But there's, some distinct differences in the morphology. So butterflies are going to have a very knobby antenna, where moths are going to have very feathery antennae. Butterflies exclusively fly during the day, and moths are going to fly at dusk and night. There are some exceptions, and that one that I was talking about, hummingbird moth, that's a sphinx moth, that one will actually fly during the day. So there are some exceptions, but mostly moths are going to fly at night. Butterflies are going to make chrysalises. The most probably famous one would be the monarch. They have this really beautiful greenish colored with jewel toned chrysalis. And moths are going to make cocoons and they're going to, and pupae. So those are generally kind of brown, ugly looking. They might bury them in the ground so you don't see them, but they're not nearly as beautiful as the butterfly chrysalis that we typically think of. Butterflies are going to rest with their wings closed. Moths are going to rest with their wings open. And butterflies, their caterpillars are smooth, and moths, the caterpillars are generally fuzzy. So some of the ones that we think about most often, the puss caterpillar, the one that has the stinging hairs that nobody wants to touch, or the saddleback caterpillar, those are actually moths, the larval form of moths, where butterflies are going to not be fuzzy at all. So here's some examples. So you can see here the moth antennae that are specialized. They're going to be these sensors that are going to pick up the scent of the opposite sex. So male moths are going to have really feathery antennae. There are some really cool looking ones that are out there, and it's kind of odd in what nature provides for the attraction or the way for the opposite sex to pick up on a potential mate. Butterfly antennae are kind of knobby and they don't show any differences between the sex. So that's called sexual dimorphism. So you can see up there the male and the female are going to be very different in how they appear. So visually speaking, you could identify which was a male and which was a female in a moth. So tips for observing them: learn the brood cycle. I know a lot of us just enjoy them out in our flower gardens, and that's just fine. We always talk about providing good nectar sources and forage plants. Um, but you'll also probably notice just by being out there and about that you're going to have different cycles. So you're going to see Gulf fritillaries at one point. You're going to see yellow swallowtails at another point. They may not overlap. They're just going to visit your gardens at different times within that brood cycle. Some may have multiple cycles, some may not. There's a lot of interesting things out there that you can learn about. What you may also note is that particular host plants are available at the time that those butterflies need them. They've coexisted. So, or they've evolved together. So it's important that if you want a particular type of butterfly in your garden, you've got to plant that particular type of host plant. You also want to try to observe not too early, I would say like 10 a.m. or something like that. So you want the dew to be off of the plants, or late afternoons. Generally, as with most pollinators, they get more active as the sun comes up. Use binoculars. That can help you see all the details on these little insects. And get yourself a really awesome app on your phone or a book that you can actually look up what those butterflies are. I know we do that with a lot of books for birds, for birding. And I mean, you can go old school with your nice field ID guide, or you can use an app. There are a lot of apps that will keep track of all of that for you. And so you just snap a picture and it will identify it for you, and then it will keep it organized by species and location, which is kind of nice. And again, collect sparingly. So if you see a dead butterfly, perfectly fine. Go ahead and collect that. Don't worry about it. It's already had its lifespan, and just I wouldn't do that with a live one. So please don't catch them and pin them if it's a live one that you've caught. So butterfly checklist. There are over 185 species of butterflies in that are possible to observe in Georgia. Sometimes you even get others that may be blown off course due to a storm system that's come through, like a hurricane, or a really strong convection system, where you have them blown up into the upper reaches of the atmosphere and pushed along with the weather system. So, this is going to be a fairly inclusive list of those that you would find in Georgia, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. So this is, unfortunately, no pictures, but you have have a lot of species lists and habitat and some other really good information. So, if you're interested, you can take a look at that. That QR code will take you to the DNR's page. And again, this goes back to when they're most active. So they're going to be most active when air temperatures are between 65 and 80 degrees, maybe a little bit warmer, but when you start getting up into the 90s and the 100s, they're usually not as active. So again, first thing in the morning when the dew's out there and it might be cooler, probably not. But after a while, late morning, early afternoon, that's going to be the best time. Um, as the day warms up, butterflies can get really active. I know some of us like to do photography, and I'm, one of those. And so sometimes you have to wait until the butterflies get nectar drunk, meaning that they've, fed and they're kind of satiated, but they're not fully, I guess, done feeding yet. So at that point, it might be worthwhile hanging around and taking some pictures. I know we all really kind of enjoy that. Um, some of them, like you see this hawk moth here feeding on phlox. Those are pretty hard to get a good picture of unless you have a very good camera that you have can get the shutter speed attuned on. iPhones have a lot of capabilities, but I haven't yet been able to perfect being able to capture one of those in action. So each species, again, is going to have a peak observation period that's going to correspond to the hatching of their brood. So you've seen maypops or the that purple flower that you've seen in the last couple slides. Passion flower vine, that's a native. Gulf fritillaries are on that. I would say probably around August-ish is the peak time when you would see them. But if you have a lot of those host plants in your garden, learn what the life cycle is of each butterfly species, and you can go out there and kind of keep track of how many broods you have on your host plants, and that helps kind of keep track of the populations going forward. When we do the pollinator census, the Great Southeast Pollinator Census now, excuse me, that's to kind of help keep track of the populations of these butterflies that are out there. Now, we don't differentiate between species. It's mostly just butterflies and moths and flies and the other pollinators. But if you want to take it a step further, you can certainly get some type of a field guide, and you can keep track of your own butterflies in your own garden, and that'll give you an idea of what kind of populations you have. I used to kind of do that when I was in grad school and into my early adult years before I had kids and I had more time. But I would keep track of the number of butterflies that I saw if I was out in my garden, the time of year that I saw them, and I guess months, days, that kind of thing. That helped kind of give me an idea. And as I added new and different plants, if it attracted more or less, if we had a harsh winter or a really warm winter, that kind of thing. So don't be fooled between or by differences between the sexes. So um, lots of species of butterflies are going to have different wing patterns. Some of them will have a light morph and a dark morph. And, it can take practice. So if you're new to, raising butterflies or having pollinator plants for butterflies or observing them in your garden, that's perfectly fine. Don't try to figure out if it's a male or female. Just work right now on trying to figure out if it's what species of butterfly it is. So here, just as a kind of an aside, we have some of our swallowtails, and you will have a light morph and a dark morph. And it really depends on which part of the state you're in. Sometimes you'll see them up here, sometimes they're more down in the southern part of the state. But yes, it is possible to have different colors of the same species of butterfly, vastly different colors. Different patterns, that kind of thing. So just kind of keep that in mind. And that's where keeping that record book is going to be handy, or just taking pictures. So the type of forage that caterpillar eats, or even the amount of sunlight, can actually change how that insect, the larval insect, looks. So I mentioned the eastern black swallowtail. That's actually the one that you can have different color morphs. But here you can see what happens when you raise, or when that caterpillar is raised in shade or part shade, and then one bright sun. So the color literally changes, which is kind of interesting. And that actually works as a form of camouflage to help, uh, I guess, deter predators from being able to see. So in the bright sun, where you have bright green, kind of like the color of the slide deck here that I'm using, that's going to be more beneficial to hiding that caterpillar if it's in the bright sun than the color morph above, which would do much better, in my opinion, in a dappled shade area, because that looks more like a dappled shade. And that's what they're trying to do. They want to blend into the plant so that the predators can't find them, so the birds can't find them and eat them. Dimorphics. So the tiger swallowtails, again, they can have either yellow or black stripes. They can have kind of a dark gray or deep blue hind wings. And the males are always going to be yellow with the black stripes. So sexual dimorphism is not exclusive to insects. You can find that in a lot of different animals too, where maybe the female might be much larger or the male might be much larger. So it's interesting when you can observe it in an insect. That makes it, or in it, it's in chickens too. I hadn't thought about that. You actually have some, they call those sex-link birds, where you can tell the chicks that are males versus the chicks that are females. But it makes it a lot easier to tell the two apart, so that that way you can tell what the male is or what the female is. And so you can see here, this is what I was alluding to earlier. About 90% of all female eastern tiger swallowtails are going to be black, but there are some dark females. And here you can kind of see the range. So it's interesting that where you see that range, it's going to overlap where the pipevine swallowtails are. So this extends all the way up into the Midwest and up into the Northeast a little bit. But it's kind of interesting, and probably an adaptation for being able to tell the difference between males and females, and or so that you don't have, I guess, crossbreeding, or which you wouldn't, but so that you don't have issues with mates finding one another. You also find that where you have some bears and some other types of animals that live in the same range, you might get different colors, or you may get completely different. You may get one where it's a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, that kind of thing. So dimorphic species, kind of a really interesting phenomenon, but here you can see what happens when you've got an overlap of a couple different species where they might share a similar host plant. So the pipevine swallowtail is going to live along in the southeast, and I haven't seen very many. I don't think I've ever seen any in my particular pollinator garden. Um, but the interesting part of it is that it feeds on a plant that is going to be poisonous, and that caterpillar then will take on that toxin. There are a lot of different animals that do that same thing. Poison dart frogs would be one of the probably most known about species that do that. But there are a lot of them that whatever the particular plant is or the food that they feed on, that they concentrate those toxins, and then that becomes part of their defense mechanisms. So they are very beautiful butterflies. um I This says, when the sun reflects right, they're as beautiful as the uh blue morpho, but only in that one little part. Blue morpho is still probably my favorite. We don't have those up here. So this is what it looks like. It's a Dutchman's pipe. It's an interesting vine, and it'll grow in the southern U.S. and it can take a long time for it to establish. So if you're down closer to the coast, you might be able to get this established, and you might see some of those pipe vines. Um, but you can definitely try, and a lot of folks around here are fans of using it in a container. So if you can get it established in a container and you can have it out there in your pollinator garden, have it growing on a trellis, people are perfectly, I've done that. And that's a good way that you can have some types of flowers that wouldn't make it through the winter here to do well going forward. You just have to store them in your garage or in a crawl space or someplace where they have a little bit of shelter from the cold winter temperatures. Mimicry. This is one of my favorites, and I do talk about this when I'm talking about the pollinator census. There's a couple different types of mimicry. There's Mullerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry, but it's used by many different species to help them survive. Sometimes it's used where you have a species that doesn't have any type of way of defending itself, will then take on what a more, I guess, dangerous species. A lot of times it's used in insects in the fact that you maybe have a wasp, and then you might have a fly that will take on a similar color pattern to make it look like the wasp so that perhaps a bird will leave it alone. In this case, um, you have the um, the blue color on the hind wings could be thought of as that pipevine caterpillar, or sorry, as the pipevine butterfly, swallowtail. And here you have a tiger swallowtail that has that very same blue color there, hopefully to be viewed as a deterrent that says, hey, I might be toxic. You might not want to eat me. So that's mimicry. And again, as I mentioned, lots of different uh, animals will use this, insects and other animals will use this. But here you can see that spicebush swallowtails aren't poisonous, and they also will do that to try to look like the pipevine swallowtail. So they figured out that that is an advantageous way to go about life, looking like a toxic insect so that they get left alone. Red spotted purple, this is one of my favorite butterflies. And again, they also have kind of adopted that strategy. They have that vivid blue flash on the back. So when they rest, when they're fluttering their wings, you can see that blue. And that says, hey, don't touch me. I might be toxic. And Diana's. So again, the female, this blue color, um, has they've also adopted that pattern. So it's interesting when you see so many different species that adopt a very similar pattern and use that mimicry to keep themselves alive longer. So here you see the female is going to look more like that pipevine, and the male is going to look more like a Gulf fritillary. Um, we don't have a lot of those here. Every so often I'll hear about them, but generally speaking, they're not one of the more abundant butterflies that we see in here and around here. Gulf fritillaries are very common around here, though. So here you can see the butterfly species that are sharing a distribution with pipe vines. So here you can see pipe vines. We occasionally see them around here, but they're just not very plentiful. They're more, you see them kind of clustered up in the lower Midwest and Northeast and over into the South and Southwest, where the spice bush, very similar pattern in some respects, down into Florida and up into the Northeast and parts of Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky, that kind of thing. So, additional warning signs. Caterpillars will also have very brightly colored spines or other appendages, and this is to make them look very scary and something that a bird would not want to eat. So, colors and horns, poisonous spines, that's going to be part of the defense that they're going to use. So, you see, you've got the Gulf fritillary caterpillar. It looks very pokey and not something that I would want to pick up. And then you have the hickory horn devil down below. I don't have any saddlebacks. I should probably put some of those in there. Or there are a few others. I actually had an interaction with one of those saddleback caterpillars. Um, Man, it was under a leaf and I didn't realize it when I went to grab the vine and pull it out and I touched it. And yeah, that thing burned for hours. It was horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Um, the puss caterpillars. Looks like you could pet them. No, don't do that. You will probably end up in the ER if you do that. So I just leave these things alone. Go ahead and enjoy them and look at them on their food source, their host plant, and just leave them be. You don't want to take the chance. Eye spots. These are interesting too. So this is the Ohio Buckeye, and the point here is that it has several spots on its wings that look like eye spots. Excuse me. So as that butterfly is sitting on its plant, feeding, it's going to lightly flap its wings and it's going to show off those eyes, those fake eyes. And what that's for is to startle a bird or something else that wants to eat it. So that bird is not going to be able to figure out, hopefully, that's what the whole reason why we have that mimicry. Uh, they're going to look at that like, I don't know. Is that the front end? Is that the back end? Can I eat that? Can I not eat that? Is it bigger than what it looks like? And that's the whole point. The insect's trying to fool it to make it think that it's bigger, to make it think that it's toxic. It's really interesting how they go about this. And you see this on caterpillars as well. So some caterpillars may have a rather large spot on it that make it look a lot bigger. They may rear back and it's a defense mechanism, but it's meant to make them look bigger and scarier than they actually are so that the predators leave them alone and move on to something else. Camouflage. That's another one. Obviously, these are all ways that they're trying to stay alive because when you're something like a little caterpillar or a little butterfly, you're easy pickings for lots of things out there. So here you see the zebra swallowtail, and it's got a pretty good camouflage. It's meant to blend in. So a couple different patterns here. You've got the uh, spring shadow pattern and a striped winged pattern. And so is it going to blend in everywhere? No, it can't do that. But it is, in the background of wherever it's feeding and its host plants and its the nectivorous plants that it's feeding on. When it's resting, it generally, wherever its habitat is, it's going to blend in fairly well. So speed and agility. I always think of skippers. They're real little bitty butterflies. They're going to be really agile. So if you've ever tried to photograph one of these things on a flower, it's really hard. Um, they're on a flower and then they're on another one and then they're on another one and they're jumping back and forth and all around. And it's really hard to photograph them unless it might be like kind of early in the morning when it's still kind of cool out and they're first out, or towards the end of the evening. Um, so this is probably Tithonia. Um, you see them a lot on zinnias. This is the Tithonia, but I see them a lot on zinnias. That's probably one of their favorite flowers. Excuse me. That Coke I drank a little earlier is causing me a few issues. But probably one of the few insects that they don't that they have a hard time getting away from is going to be the praying mantis. And praying mantises, they're really interesting and they're really cool insects. And a lot of times they will set up shop near plants, pollinator plants, and they hunt that way. So they're pretty smart. They know where their prey is, and they will go and hang out in and around there, and they camouflage themselves. They can be brown or green. They'll hang out nearby and they'll capture those butterflies. And so you know they're there when you see a bunch of nipped wings that have fallen on the ground. And that's a good indication that you have a praying mantis around feeding on your butterflies. At that point, if you like your butterflies a lot, you might want to find him and relocate him someplace else. All right, more mimicry. So the great purple hair streak lives on mistletoe. So mistletoe is um it grows around here. You usually see it more in the winter time, and it's a parasitic plant. So mistletoe is going to grow into the branch that the seed lives on, has landed on. It's going to grow into that tree, and it's going to use its circulatory system as its own. So it's going to get its nutrients and everything from whatever tree it happens to be in. But the great purple hair streak is going to live on mistletoe. And when you see it from the side, it just doesn't look like much. It's going to be kind of black and blend in. But when it flits its wings, you can see it's really pretty. It's got a nice blue iridescent color. So it also has these kind of weird crinkly tails that come off of its wings. And so the thought here is that a bird that's trying to eat this thing, it's got kind of these eye spots. So when it's flitting its wings, that bird is going to be zeroed in on those eye spots, and then it's going to look at those crinkles, the little tails off of there, and it's going to be confused, and it might then try to go for the tail. Well, better that than the rest of the insect. So that's another way, I guess, of mimicry so that hopefully you stay alive a little bit longer. Monarchs. So the monarch and the viceroy, that's called Batesian mimicry. And it's thought of to be that the advantage was that the monarch tastes bad, which, it gets that from feeding on milkweed, and the viceroy did not. So it's using that taste aversion that birds have to monarchs to stay alive. But um, this is basically stating that the researchers showed that both species taste bad, and it's a verging or converging traits that signal bad taste. So, if that makes sense, this is called Mullerian mimicry, meaning that they both share traits. They both have a taste aversion to birds. It's just that's how they've evolved. So this is more of a kind of keep an eye open that just because we've thought about it for a really long time in that way, it's not settled science. We're learning stuff as we go all along. Things change. I can even say from when I went to college, got my undergrad, to when, now my daughter's in college, things have changed a great deal in classifications and other stuff. So things are always changing. So just beware of people that talk about settled science. So butterfly life cycle, um, it's interesting. It's pretty easy to follow, I mean, as compared to some other types of insects. So you have your egg, then you have a larva, and then you have the chrysalis, and then it goes through a transformation and it comes out as an adult. And then you'll have those adults that are finding and feeding and then finding each other, laying eggs, and starting the whole process over again. So that entire life cycle can take, depending on the butterfly, of course, can take up to 65 days, or possibly overwintering with monarchs for 6 or 7 months. So I want to take a second and talk about monarchs. So there was some research that was released pretty recently that talked about monarchs. And I know we've been hearing for a long time, at least for probably the last decade, that monarchs are endangered. They're not really endangered, but their migration patterns are changing. So we have what we call flyways, and the monarchs follow these. You have migratory waterfowl, they follow a similar one. Those are called flyways. And some of the thoughts on why they're not migrating anymore is that one interesting thought is that tropical milkweed is being planted. It's readily available and it's being planted all up and down these flyway corridors by folks that think they're helping the monarch. But because tropical milkweed lasts longer, it has a longer flowering period than some of the native milkweeds. It's encouraging those monarchs to stay in areas that normally they wouldn't, for instance, the Southeast. So if you're a monarch that lives up in, say, Wisconsin, it's going to get cold up there. So you're going to probably follow the flyway down, but you may not go back all the way to Mexico because once you get down to, say, South Georgia or Louisiana or Alabama, you might have some tropical milkweed that you can feed off of, and there's no need for you to go all the way down to Mexico again. Same thing with Florida. A lot of people will plant tropical milkweed, and there's no need to leave Florida for Mexico. So a lot of the monarchs that normally would have migrated all the way down to Mexico no longer have to. Where if you have the swamp milkweed or some of the other native species of milkweeds, those have a finite lifespan. They're going to flower, they're going to produce seed, and it's shorter than the tropical milkweed. It has an a beginning and an end. And so when those go and their food source and the host plant for their young is gone, they're going to leave, but they have no need to do that now. So there's a theory, in that. So they're losing that ability to migrate. And a lot of them are just staying in the southeastern US or down in the south in like Florida and just feeding all year. So that was kind of interesting. That was definitely worth a read. So here's where it's talking kind of about the migratory process. So it's synchronous with the emergence of new leaves on the milkweed. And, again, this is for a migratory monarch. We've also had some issues with OE, a virus. So you end up with monarchs that have crinkly wings, they can't fly, they have other issues. And a lot of that can be tied to folks that try to raise these butterflies together in large enclosures. They're not going to necessarily be living together in such close quarters if they're wild, but when reared in captivity, you end up almost forcing the issue. That plus, of course, we have some issues with plants that come from nurseries that have used insecticides. So, labeling is very important. If you're going to purchase some of these milkweeds, that you purchase ones that they haven't used something like that. I mean, there's a lot of problems here, and it really requires some reading and some research to make sure that you're not part of the problem, that you're part of the solution. So these are the butterfly eggs, and they can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and they look like, really intricate little jewels, and some are really boring and don't look like anything. Um, so, take a look here. Some of them are going to be laid in large groups, and that's meant that they hatch all about the same size and at the same time, so that if there's a predator, at least a few of them will have an opportunity to survive. And some of them might be individually laid. Monarchs will typically do that. And that's just so that caterpillar then will have the best opportunity to survive to adulthood, because it will have all that food for itself. So anytime you've had caterpillars, and a lot of them, you'll note that they can eat a lot. I went out to the Athens Botanical Garden a couple years ago, and it was in, I would say, mid-September. So about the time that monarchs are really chowing down and trying to get to the point where they can form a chrysalis and pupate. And they had planted a ton of milkweed all around the entrance to the visitor center area in those planting beds. And those caterpillars had stripped off every bit of leaf on those plants. And you had to be really careful about walking around, because all these little caterpillars were just inching along, and they were looking for some place to crawl up and pupate, but they were all over the place. It was probably one of the most impressive things I'd seen. And then those who had already formed a chrysalis, just the stone walls of the visitor center and the art gallery next door had chrysalises all over the place. I mean, it was really pretty cool, actually. It was really pretty cool. But pretty much, they're not going to go through that process until they've got enough food stored to get them through metamorphosis into adulthood. So if you want to plant things like the swamp milkweed or the other types of butterfly weed, Asclepias species, make sure you put enough in there that you can support the population that you're hoping for, at least anyway, for them to go from through the different stages into adulthood. So what they're going to do is they're going to locate a safe place. So when they are ready to go and they're ready to pupate, they're going to go find someplace, usually someplace sheltered. You can see here they're getting underside of some grass. They're going to attach themselves to the stem, and then they're going to split their skin starting at the back of the head, and then they're going to shed that outer skin, and that inner skin is going to it's going to harden and form a chrysalis. So remember I said that the chrysalis of a monarch caterpillar is very pretty. You can see there it's kind of green, and each of those little beads on there is going to be like a brilliant gold color. I mean, that's just fantastic that nature can do that, but it's pretty cool. And here you see again, after 2 to 4 weeks, you can see the different stages. Here you can kind of tell the wings of the monarch through that chrysalis. And then here you can see the butterfly is starting to emerge. Here it's emerged out of the chrysalis, and they have to plump their wings up. So they've got to get the circulation going, and the hemolith has to, go through the wings. Here you can see they're getting bigger, expanding, and then finally you have the adult butterfly. So this process can take several hours. So they need to be in kind of a sheltered location to do this, so that they don't get injured. And this goes for both moths and butterflies, but it's a really cool process. So, obviously, as I said, they have to stretch their wings out and allow them to dry and become rigid. So, this says 20 minutes, but I've kind of timed it before. I guess it depends on where the butterfly is. It took a lot longer than that. I guess on a really hot day, hot sunny day, it could be about that. But they have to kind of hold them and stretch them flat. And as I mentioned, they're very vulnerable during this time. So if you see a butterfly emerging, it's okay if you want to try to watch it and kind of keep the predators away, give it a chance that way. So at this point, they're pretty passive. And so I don't like this person trying to eat that butterfly, but that's a good point because they have to try to emerge and go through this process as quickly as possible so they don't get eaten. Again, I think at least from what my observation's been, it's more than 20 minutes, but um, yeah, that's probably I don't know where they get these pictures. So here you can see this is a host plant. This is a milkweed. And so some people and I see these on a lot of Facebook pages where you may have new gardeners that just don't know a lot about the process. And they'll find one of these little caterpillars on their plant and they're like, do I squish it? Is it bad? And everyone's like, no, don't do that. Don't touch, leave it alone. It's a butterfly. That's its host plant. And they're like, what is a host plant? So then, the goodness of our gardeners' hearts, we tell them, that's actually a plant that monarch, that swallowtail, that's a caterpillar. It's going to be a butterfly. Let it, continue to feed. But here you can see how stripped that plant is by the time those caterpillars are ready to pupate. And then just a little while longer after that, after, they've pupated, it'll flush back out again and it'll grow new leaves. And yeah, so don't worry about that plant. A lot of times people are afraid that their plants are gonna die, but no, that plant's meant to do this, and it's gonna be just fine. So migration. Um, so a lot of different species. It's not just monarchs, including painted lady, giant sulfur. They're gonna travel south so that they can, because some of these, especially the generations born later in the summer, they don't have enough time to complete their life cycle. So they're going to migrate down south so that they have that opportunity of doing that. And here, we talk about the Eastern monarch and flying down to Mexico. And I mentioned that that's becoming less and less. And it's not because the caterpillars along the southeast or the northeastern flyway and down into the southeast are lessening in numbers. It's because they are spending more time in the southeast because of what they suspect with the tropical milkweed. There's enough food here. They don't need to continue on down into Mexico. So they just kind of hang out here. We've had some issues with Canada geese with that too. They find that there's plenty of food here, so they have zero effort in migrating like they used to. So technically they are classified as a migratory waterfowl, but they're not migrating. If you live on a lake in a subdivision, you probably see them right now. There's a lot of them that are out there grazing in and around rough areas, and they have no desire to move. They'll just hop around from place to place. So it's not alone, the monarch's problem alone. There are other species that are dealing with this same issue. So here, there are still monarchs that do migrate. Here you can see when they are migrating, this is where they're going. So they're going to have their winter resting grounds. So the West Coast monarchs in some of them may go up along the mountain spine of the mountains there. Some of the ones in California may move a little further inland, and that's timed with when those plants, the forage plants, are growing, and that's the host plants for their young. So they've learned to migrate as milkweed grows and comes back in the spring. So they will literally move north as the milkweed starts to leaf out and to flower. So yes, that like I said, there still are migrating butterflies, but not nearly as many as they used to be. And there were, I can't remember how long it was, maybe a decade ago, there was a large die-off. They had some really cold weather down there and they lost a lot of butterflies. So that's the next generation. And again, remember, not every monarch is going to migrate, but they did lose a large portion. But they have done some studies and shown that the population is rebounded. Um, but again, not everyone is migrating. I also want to talk about Florida and the monarchs there. So OE is it's a problem. It's a viral problem, and similar to honeybees and varroa mites, which carry a virus, several viruses, and then feed on the lymph of the bee, they can transmit these viruses, and then they'll end up with stunted wings. They'll end up with an inability to fly or feed, and those butterflies then unfortunately can't survive because they can't feed, they can't breed, and then you lose that genetic lineage. And that's becoming a problem now in Florida. And there are a couple Facebook pages that I'm a member of one, and they really encourage people, especially in Florida, don't take those caterpillars in and try to raise them because that's part of the problem, as I mentioned, is you've got too many insects, too many caterpillars in one location. They're spreading it amongst themselves. You have to be real careful not to spread some of these diseases. So it can take several generations to complete a migration cycle. So they go down into Mexico. They may spend that time there. They may make it up into southern Texas or somewhere there. And then you have another generation and they fly further north. So it's a long trip. But they do it. Again, they still migrate. Here you can see this is pretty old, but you can see the migration, very similar like with hummingbirds. People will track them and put it on a map so that they can tell when they're moving through the area. And flip through these tagging. So some people will do this. They'll tag their butterflies so that people who see them along the migratory path can tell that they've been in different locations. We do this with a variety of animals. There's all sorts of tags, both with insects, with fish, with birds, all of that. And that's a way of telling migratory patterns, populations, things like that. Diapause. So, um, hatched butterflies will try to mate pretty quickly after they plump their wings out and all of that because that's the healthiest they're ever going to be. We've all seen really ratty butterflies flittering about. So they want to, as soon as they're hatched, as soon as they're plump, it's they're healthiest they're going to be. Um, but as I mentioned before, it can take a couple generations to really complete the life cycle. So it's interesting depending on the life cycle that you have, what they're doing. So um, monarchs that hatch in that really late fall, they're not going to mate right away. They're just trying to get some food so that they can pupate and then, try to migrate to, um, be able to continue their lineage. So they're trying to get, for those that are migrating, they're trying to get to their overwintering grounds. So they're not interested in reproducing at this point. They're just interested in surviving, in other words. And there are all sorts of animals that go into diapause. It's kind of like a suspended animation, if you want to call it that. And, you know, again, this is a kind of a call to action, if you will. Obviously, herbicides. Yeah, try not to. This is where, I preach IPM, integrated pest management, and use of cultural methods, biological methods, organics, and then last of all, using some type of a chemical at the top of that pyramid so that you don't affect the pollinator populations. And then here it was 2002 when I talked about in Mexico when they had that really cold winter freeze that really just axed off part of that monarch population. So here, most eggs, they can lay up to 200 eggs. And again, they're one of those that lays like a singular egg here, a singular egg there. But try as much as you can to plant those native plants that they desperately need. And, mow instead of spray, use a weed whacker if you can. Provide habitat, provide forage for them. And I don't know really what you can do about windshield deaths, but just try to do what you can. And we're about at the end of time right now, so I'm going to defer. And if anybody's interested in the slide deck, it's a little bit longer. There's a lot of information in this. I probably could have talked about 3 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so I don't go really over. And I will see if there are any questions. Has the tropical milkweed in Florida gone wild, or are people planting it? Okay, so Florida has all sorts of problems with invasive species. It's tropical, and I mean, you can find wild lantana. We don't have wild lantana up here, but yes, it's gone wild, and it's not something that you know I people probably meant to do, but it's a perennial there, and it just in any other tropical situation, it just lives year round. So I would say. Um, Here, probably not as much of an issue. We're actually not really in a flyway for monarchs right here. You see them occasionally. If we get a lot of storms, you'll get them. Um, they'll kind of come in. I've seen a couple, but some years when you have a lot of heavy weather systems that come through, you'll see a lot of them. And they basically get pulled in from the Mississippi Flyway or even from Kentucky. There's one up in Kentucky, Tennessee, Kentucky. You'll get some of them that will kind of push down into North Georgia and down here into the Atlanta metro area. So you might see more of them there. But generally speaking, there's not a ton of monarchs in this particular area. The population in Florida is kind of endemic. It just lives there. It doesn't really migrate, but we do get migratory monarchs here. I have. Okay, so let's see. Do you have a butterfly caterpillar book you recommend? I think it was in part one. I didn't actually recommend a book per se. I prefer to use apps a lot. I do have some butterfly books. It's really a preference. Now, I have one Seek. It's by iNaturalist, and you can take a picture of all sorts of different animals, including butterflies and other insects, and then it will identify that for you, and it will keep it filed away by region and area so that if you see it again, maybe you forgot that you'd seen it before, it'll remind you. It'll say, oh, you had a picture here. Do you want to replace that picture? You already have that on your life list. And then it'll give you goals to kind of meet. But there are all sorts of apps out there that now will help you identify insects. It'll help you identify birds, either by look or by call, by plants. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff out there. But if you're old school, there are all sorts of decent field guides that you can get. I still use a Kaufman field guide. I have some for birds. I have plants. I have insects, and they're good to just kind of flip through if you want to be old school. Nothing wrong with that. You can get some post-it notes and dog-ear your pages that way to say with the date that you saw that particular butterfly. That can be kind of fun and kind of relive that as you see it. So I don't have a particular in print field guide. There are a lot out there. I would say just go and kind of peruse through some at a bookstore and see which one you like. But the ones that show a distribution map, the ones that have a good color pictures or drawings of what the butterfly looks like and talks about the locations and where you can find them and that kind of thing. If you like it, go for it. If it's going to get you out there so that you stay involved in looking for those particular butterflies for your life list. Um, go. I think everybody should have a life list. I do for birds. Some people do for insects. You know, all of them. That's you want to be a naturalist. We like to scatter lots of parsley plants throughout the garden for both us and the swallowtails. Yes, definitely. Parsley is a host plant for quite a few different butterflies. Cilantro, let's see what else. Definitely the passion flower vine. Um, some of those sphinx, I mean, tomato hornworms, those turn into moths, but I always tell people plant some extra tomatoes. It doesn't cost you anything to do that, and they will like you for it because you'll help their population. So many of them get killed because we don't want them eating our tomatoes. So just, plant some extra tomatoes for them. But you also get those kinds of moths on gardenias and hydrangeas. Um, I mean, it's pretty interesting just if you take a second to look around you and see there's so many different moths and butterflies out there and so many different types of host plants. Trees can be host plants. You'll get the orange striped oakworm. We get complaints about those all the time because usually I have an oak that overhangs a driveway and then they eat the leaves off of that and it lands on the car. The frass does, the poo, and people are like, how do I get rid of them? And they're only there for a couple weeks. And usually it's the branch way up in the top of the tree. So there's like no really good way to get rid of them. But yeah, there's a lot of it. Fennel is a good one. Yes, I agree. Uh, 15 to 20 tail swallowtails, 15 to 20 swallowtail caterpillars. That's awesome. Yeah, I bet it stripped that clean. I've got a fennel plant out in my garden and I had quite a few on mine as well. So, be that oasis and get your neighbors to be that oasis also. How many milkweed plants are enough to feed them? I would tell people to plant, maybe plant them in threes. I usually go by, that rule, the floral rule, which is plant in odd numbers. Some of them will spread if you have the right conditions. So you don't have to worry about losing it, but you can plant different types of milkweed. I don't know, I would say like 8 or 9 plants out there of various species. And you'll notice that the butterfly weed, the orange flowered butterfly weed, when it blooms, suddenly you're like, oh, along the roadsides and in power line right of ways, you're like, oh, there's actually a lot of that out there. So, but you can get seeds and you can start it by seed and plant it in your garden. I've seen the seeds sold at big box stores. You can order them online. You can order, sometimes you'll get the nurseries, the native plant nurseries will sell uh, various types of butterfly weed or milkweed. But, don't forget about zinnias and the other food producing plants. You want to do a combination of both host plants and of forage plants for the butterflies. Does anybody have any other questions? No? So if you're interested, I can provide the slide deck to you. It's pretty hefty. So it will go through all the different species. Oh, I have milkweed seeds I direct sow now in the fall, right? Yeah. I'm not sure on those if they need to be cold stratified. Most things I'll collect the seed and then I'll just keep it out on my porch, my covered porch. That way it gets what it needs. So yeah, you can sow them now if you would like to. And keeping them moist might be a challenge, but you can always use a little bit of mulch or something like that. And just make sure they get a nice drink of water in the spring when we get back to warmer temperatures. So if you're interested and you want the slide deck, I'll put my email address in here. And you can reach out to me there and I will be happy to provide that. Oh, there you go. Yeah, if people go to the Master Gardener meetings over at Bethesda, they have seeds that they can share. So they usually have all sorts of different seeds. So I guess they also have milkweed seeds, which is nice. Um, but yes, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at that email address. Otherwise, that will conclude the pollinator information. This was a fairly hefty one. I probably could have done part three on it, but thank you all for attending and have a good evening. Until next time.